Hi. So every once in a while I come across something that I think is really interesting, whether it's a topic or an argument, but I can't necessarily fit it into a scripted video or longer video because it's either too isolated or too tangential, or there just isn't a lot of content associated with it. But I don't want to lose it or forget about it, and I think it can add something unique to the conversation surrounding young earth creationism that I haven't heard talked about before. So what I'm going to be doing is organizing my thoughts into videos or essays and posting them as part of a new series, Something Interesting. So welcome to episode 1 of Something Interesting. The argument that I want to address today has to do with the geologic column and quote-unquote out-of-order rock layers. But before I dive into the young earth creationist argument, I want to establish a quick baseline on what the geologic column is. So essentially the idea of the geologic column is that you can correlate and corroborate layers from all across the world, rock layers from all across the world, into one single geologic column. So say in one location on the continent you come across a rock formation that has a red sandstone and on top of it a black shale. And then a couple hundred miles away, you find that same black shale, but then on top of it, there's a layer of, chert and then a layer of tuff, etc., etc. Well, because this black shale bridges the gap between these two rock formations, you can correlate them into one single layer and say the red sandstone's on bottom, and then the black shale comes next, and then the chert, and then the tuff. And the idea behind the geologic column is that you can correlate every or almost every rock layer from anywhere around the world into a complete column of geologic time. And that's what geologists and geochronologists try to do. You've probably heard of the periods and epochs and eras that make up Earth's geologic past, like the Precambrian, the Cambrian, the Permian, the Triassic, etc., etc. Now, obviously this concept of deep time and the geologic column doesn't fit with the young earth creationist framework for how these rock layers supposedly formed and the time frames and time scales involved. So to try and counter this concept, young earth creationists turn to quote-unquote out-of-order rock layers. That is, they say, well, this rock layer isn't where you would expect it to be in the fossil record or the geologic column, so it must be out of order, and that makes your system inconsistent. The example that young earth creationists use of out-of-order rock layers is overthrusts. In conventional geology, an overthrust is created when tectonic activity over time pushes or thrusts a sheet of rock or a rock layer over top of other layers. So now this rock layer has been pushed totally out of its normal position, the position it was made in the geologic column. It's been, elevated or pushed under other rock layers. And young earth creationists look at this and they say, well, no, there's no such thing as overthrusting. This rock layer hasn't been pushed anywhere at all. Actually, it was deposited exactly where we see it today. And because it's in the place it was deposited, that makes it inconsistent with the geologic column. So if you see a Permian rock layer that's way up on top of, these Triassic or Jurassic rock layers, well, that's proof that the geologic column is inconsistent because there's no way that this was pushed up there. It was formed there in the first place. I should mention that I am getting this argument from an article on creationwiki.org. This isn't actually something that all young earth creationists believe, and actually in a book here, there's a totally contradictory opinion on overthrusts that I'll get to a little bit later. The Creation Wiki article uses a specific example. It only has one example of an inconsistent overthrust, and the example it uses is the Qilian Shan mountains in China. So I spent some time researching the Qilian Shan formation, and I think that one thing that the authors of this article assumed that maybe isn't true is that this overthrust layer in the Qilian Shan formation looks like the flat, horizontal layers that you see maybe in the walls of the Grand Canyon, where you have these clean-cut rock layers, all piled on top of each other, and then you have this one rock layer that doesn't match the others, that doesn't match the geologic column, that is just somehow right in the middle there. And that's really not what we see at all. So if you go and look at the actual Qilian Shan, you'll see that it looks more like this. It looks like this fan-shaped thrust fault zone that's buckled and folded up on top of other rock layers. And I think it's important to realize that this rock layer isn't necessarily on top of other rock layers in the way you would think it is. If you look at some of the graphics, you can see some of the diagrams, you can see that it's kind of more above in elevation, but not necessarily directly above as far as a rock layer. Yes, technically this blue is above this yellow, but it's pretty easy to tell that it wasn't formed that way, especially because this blue correlates with other blue rocks that are way down below, these other basement Cambrian rocks. Now, one of the interesting papers I found on the Qilian Shan was about its magnetostratigraphy. So, if you don't know, when a rock layer is being deposited, it has a lot of tiny metal particles and magnetic particles in it, and they sort of act like compass needles. Like if you put a needle on a leaf and set it, to float on some water, it'll spin and turn and point north. But if you take that same needle on a leaf and you say put it on concrete, it's not going to spin and turn north because now there's friction, there's a solid rock involved. And the same thing happens with these little magnetic particles in rocks. While the rocks are still soft and deformed, these little magnetic particles will align themselves with the Earth's magnetic field. But as the rock solidifies and lithifies, they'll be stuck in place and held in place. And then as the Earth's magnetic field shifts and changes over time, those shifts and changes won't affect those magnetic particles that are already in the rocks. So these rock layers have a record of the Earth's magnetic field when they were deposited. They have a magnetic signature that matches the Earth's magnetic field when this rock solidified and hardened. So then you can take these magnetic signatures from these rock layers all across the world, and you'll find that a lot of times they match up and they correlate into a single long graph that encompasses all of these rock layers. Just like the geologic column, there's a magnetostratigraphy column. Creationists believe that the Earth's magnetic field shifted very rapidly during the flood, so that entire graph can be condensed down to the course of a few months. But whether it covered a long period or a short period, either way, we can use this to test whether the Qilian Shan is an overthrust or not. Because if it is an overthrust, then it's going to be mismatched with the rocks around it, right? Because this rock didn't solidify next to the rocks below it. It solidified, much earlier and then was pushed into place above them. But if this was always there, if it was deposited during the flood, well, all these rocks are solidifying in the months and years after the flood. And so it's going to flow, the magnetic signature of this overthrust is going to flow with the rock layers above and below it. But what we actually see when we look at the Qilian Shan is that the magnetic signatures are mismatched, which is really strong evidence that this rock layer didn't solidify, it didn't lithify right next to these other layers. Temporally speaking, it solidified at a very different time period. In fact, we can match when this rock layer solidified, and it matches to an earlier period in time with its magnetic signature. I think now is a good time to bring up what some other creationists believe about overthrusts, specifically from the book The Global Flood by John Morris, associated with the Institute for Creation Research. So what they say about overthrusts is that these rock formations couldn't have formed except during the flood. They do accept that overthrusts are real and that overthrusts are created when tectonic activity pushes a rock layer, but they say that there would be too much friction and these rock layers would be totally destroyed by this process. So they say these rock layers had to be soft and they had to be, pliable so that there wasn't too much friction and there was some plasticity and there was some lubrication. But the problem with that is if this rock layer was pushed into place while it was still soft, remember these magnetic particles only become trapped when the rock layer hardens. So these magnetic particles would perfectly match the rock layers above and below as far as, chronologically. They would flow into each other. But again, we see that it's mismatched. So that means that this rock layer could not have been pushed into place until after it had hardened. And this causes a lot of problems for Young Earth Creationists because, the Qilian Shan mountains have existed for a long time. We have records of earthquakes in these mountains dating back to, the early ADs in Chinese records. So you have to explain how this massive overthrusting happened in a few hundred years after the flood, which there's really no mechanism for that. There's no way to explain how that happened. Going back to Creation Wiki's argument, the problem is even bigger because if there was no overthrusting at all, if this rock was, formed exactly where it is today, well, you have to explain why its magnetic signature doesn't match with the rock layers around it. There's really no way to explain it. And it's not just that. There are actually a couple other lines of evidence that lead us to believe that this rock layer was, overthrust and uplifted. At the time period where we believe the Qilian Shan was uplifted, all of a sudden, the rock layers surrounding the Qilian Shan, the grain direction is suddenly turned so that it's perpendicular facing away from the Qilian Shan, which makes perfect sense because if you have a river running down from this suddenly uplifted new mountain range, the rivers are going to be running away from this mountain range. And as they run away, the sediment that they leave behind is going to be pointed away from it. And there's really no other way to explain this, right? Because you don't have two currents going in two different directions at the same time in the same place. That doesn't happen even in a global flood. So this change in the current direction in these rock layers can only be explained really by a very significant time difference between them. But that's not the only change that we see in these rock layers surrounding the Qilian Shan at the time of the Qilian Shan's uplift. We also see a change in inclusions in these rock layers. We start to see zircon crystals and eroded sediment from these Qilian basement rocks showing up in the rocks around it. And this is really interesting because now we have several different direct lines of evidence that all converge on a single proposition, right? So first of all, we have the fact that the Qilian Shan is on an active thrust-flow system. It's on a fault line. And every overthrust that we find, every supposedly out-of-order rock layer is on one of these fault lines, which is, it's an interesting coincidence that the only times that the geologic column is out of order is when a very significant tectonic fault is involved. And it's not just that it's on a fault line, we're also seeing that the magnetostratigraphy doesn't match. And then we're seeing that the zircon, the uranium dates from these zircon crystals doesn't match. And then we're seeing that the grain direction shifts significantly at the same time as this rock layer is being uplifted and thrust over. Say you have a group of students and you think they're cheating on a multiple choice test. Well, if you compare all the answers that these students got correct, well, of course they're going to be the same answer because there's only one correct answer. If all the students say A on question 1 and A is the correct answer on question 1, well, that doesn't tell you anything. But if on, say, question number 4, all of these students say C and C is the wrong answer, and on question number 12, all of the students say B and B is the wrong answer, and on question number 15, all of them say D and D is the wrong answer, well, now you have a case that maybe these students are copying off each other, right? It's pretty easy to predict a linear pattern. If the pattern is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it's, there are a lot of different methods that could come up with this same pattern. But if you take two options in this pattern and randomly switch them around, well, this pattern's much harder to come up with. 1, 2, 3, 6, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 is a little bit more confusing. And that's showing the predictive power of the geologic column because these rare exceptions where a rock layer is out of place, well, the magnetostratigraphy disagrees, the zircon dating disagrees, the paleocurrent switches, and it's on an active fault line. And there's really no way to explain this other than the events that the geochronologists are mapping and saying happened in the geologic history of this rock formation actually happened. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something interesting about the Qilian Shan and overthrust rock layers. I included all of the different sources that I used in the description of the video, and I hope you learned something. So thanks for watching. Bye.